ride and the invention of broadcast news, and that will be right here in the auditorium, and that will be 7 to 9 at night on February 20th. I also want to make an announcement that's not on the program or on our lecture series, but the day before that, on February 19th, we're going to be having a rededication of Schaefer Hall. Some of you may know this, some of you may not know this, but the Bismarck Junior College was, the original land of Bismarck Junior College was donated to the college by Harold Schaefer, and the building was originally called Bismarck Junior College, and then later on it picked up the name Schaefer Hall in honor of Harold. And so on the 19th of February, right here in this auditorium, we're going to have a rededication. And that rededication, we will be talking more about Harold Schaefer. And our guest that day will be the Honorable Ed Schaefer, who is past Secretary of Agriculture as well as Governor of the state of North Dakota, and Shyla Schaefer, who's in the audience today. And we just love having you here, Shyla. Thank you very much for joining us. So if you can make it on the 19th of February, we encourage you to come at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're going to do a rededication of Schaefer Hall. For those of you that are new to this series, I would like to give some opening comments here, and I'm going to make sure I follow everything. I'm going to follow my notes here a little bit, if you don't mind. To begin with, I want to say at the outset, when I approached Clay Jenkinson about doing a series, a lecture series, he agreed to it only if it was conversational, and thus I became the other half of this act. And actually, as it turns out, folks, it's my job to keep him on track, I'm finding out. But no, so I've become the second half of this. I don't know about those of you that have been attending, but Clay and I have certainly had a good time doing this, and it's been a lot of fun. We certainly appreciate all the support that we've been getting. And we said from the outset that this was an experiment. We were going to get together, Clay and I were going to sit up here, and we were going to have conversations, and we were just going to have fun doing it. But we're adding another component to it today. So while we sit here in Sidney J. Lee Auditorium on the campus of Bismarck State College, our program is being webcast to the employees of the National Information Solutions Cooperative. Most of us know it as NISC. NISC is an information technology company that develops and supports software and hardware solutions for member owners who are primarily utility cooperatives and telecommunication companies across the nation. NISC is an industry leader providing advanced integrated IT solutions for consumers and subscriber billing, accounting, engineering, and operations, as well as other leading-edge IT solutions. Today, NISC has over 5 million consumers in 47 states and America Samoa that receive utility and telecommunication services from companies utilizing NISC's advanced information technology systems. NISC employs over 600 individuals across 2 major locations in Mandan, North Dakota, and Lake St. Louis, Missouri. So today, we are welcoming NISC into this experiment. And we're going to find out how well this works out, by the way. Another thing I know about NISC is that it has developed a learning culture. So as such, when I approached Mr. Vern Dosh, the CEO of NISC, with a proposal to try this, he jumped at the chance. So between his smart IT people and our smart IT people, they figured out how this was going to happen. So today, if the technology gods are with us, the NISC employees will be watching us and have the capability to ask us questions through a chat room. So our very own Jane Schreck, who's sitting down here with a laptop, will let us know if somebody in the NISC realm has any questions, and they will chat to her, and then she will read those questions to us. So this is really experimental. So for those of you here in the auditorium and to our friends in Mandan and Lake St. Louis, Missouri, we welcome all of you. It is now my privilege to introduce Mr. Clay Jenkinson, Bismarck State College's Distinguished Scholar of the Humanities. Clay is a Rhodes and Danforth Scholar, is a published author, and one of the leading public humanities scholars in the United States. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio program from Bismarck called the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and works as a speaker, consultant, and a facilitator. Clay was a major contributor to Ken Burns' public television series Jefferson, and has portrayed Jefferson in 49 states. Who's the 50th one?
Alaska.
Alaska. Okay, well, we'll have to work on that one. Before Supreme Court justices, presidents, state legislators, and countless audiences, as well as the Today Show, Politically Incorrect, and CNN. Clay co-founded the modern Chautauqua movement. He is currently director of the Dakota Institute through the Fort Mandan Foundation, chief consultant to the Theodore Roosevelt Center through Dickinson State University, and a columnist for the Bismarck Tribune. He has an MA from Oxford University in Cambridge, England, a BA in English Literature from Vanderbilt University, and a BA in English from the University of Minnesota. So today's presentation, please welcome Mr. Clay Jenkins.
Larry, I know you know that Oxford is in Oxford, not Cambridge.
I do know that.
You said Oxford University in Cambridge, England, and we'll get letters.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, it's what my script said.
Okay.
So,
anyway,
yeah,
it's great to see you.
Well, it's nice having you here. Now, what I do want to start with, which really isn't the program today, and we're going to get to the program today, but Clay just returned from the inauguration, and he was invited to the inauguration, and I'm going to let him fill in what he did. He actually had an official role. You didn't write the Chief Justice's card, did you? You're just checking. But Clay did have a role there, and so I would just like Clay to chat with us a little bit about what it was like to be at the inauguration, what he did, and fill us in a little bit.
Well, thanks. In fact, I brought you a gift, Larry. I brought you the best gift of all. I brought you the Washington Post for Wednesday, which I read in its entirety on the plane coming back. I got home at 1 a.m. this morning, and after many, many difficulties. And it's really an extraordinary. I know you never bring me gifts from your travels, but I brought you this, and I hope you enjoy it. But,
thank you very much.
You know, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, and that's not the subject today. But there's a certain way in which it fits. I was very fortunate to be asked to come to give a presentation as Thomas Jefferson to a group of 700 people in a restaurant at a party right next to the Capitol. And so we were in and out on the Mall and not, but none of that's important. What's important is that Tuesday, by any historical standard, when histories are written 100 years from now, 500 years from now, Tuesday, January 20th, 2009, will be one of the top 10 incidents in American history. And of course, because the first African-American president was sworn in that day, but it goes way deeper than that. There was a congressman that I had a chance to meet from Colorado, from Golden, and he had been up on the steps, and he said that during the ceremony, which lasted for about 90 minutes, he spent most of his time looking over the head of the president-elect to the sea of people out on the Mall. And there were maybe 2 million people between the steps of the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial. And so I sort of did the math on that. It's a 2-mile piece of territory, 390 acres. And there were 3 times the entire population of North Dakota on a little pencil-thin ribbon of land for 2 miles between the Capitol steps and the Lincoln Memorial. It was the largest crowd in the history of Washington, D.C. It was the largest crowd in the history of presidential inaugurations. It was certainly the largest crowd that I was ever in the whole course of my life. And what this congressman was looking at was this sea of humanity. 60% of the people, at least, were African American. And of the remaining 40% or so, half of those were people of color of one sort or another. In other words, not Caucasians in quite the same sense that you and I are. And it was just, I mean, that was really the story. And the photograph, maybe you've seen the photograph, in this paper there is a double truck photograph of the Mall. And it is wall-to-wall people. It was actually a little frightening. The press of people was so great. That photograph, I'm sure, will be distributed as posters and so on. That photograph immediately takes its place as one of the great images of modern history, along with, say, the picture of the moon of the Earth taken from the moon in July of 1969, or the picture of the Vietnamese girl running naked from the napalm from 1972. I mean, we're living in one of the creases, one of the pivot moments of history right now. And the story is partly about Barack Obama, but the story really is when you turn the lens and see the people that came to witness that moment. And even though you were better off being at a television anywhere in America, I mean, it was really a hassle. Logistically, it was a nightmare, even for the people who got in, and there were plenty who didn't. But everyone who was there, not only will never forget it, but it's way deeper than that. Everyone who was there was a witness to something, and the refrain of it, in a sense, was, there's no turning back. We have crossed the threshold, and what comes next, who knows? But the sense of almost planetary history was palpable to everybody who was there. And every person who was there is now talking, as I am, about his or her own story, how they got there, the sacrifice that it took. I stayed in a hotel in Alexandria, and it was just ruinously expensive. I mean, it was obscenely expensive. It was expensive to the point that you think, this is really just insane. And I'm not a wealthy man at all, but I, in a sense, can afford that. But when I looked at the people who were also staying in that hotel, many of them had done way more sacrifice to afford that moment. And I asked everyone that I saw for the 2 days, I said, what's the meaning of this? And one woman said to me, you know what, I would have mortgaged my house to be here. This is the greatest moment of my life. And you heard that story over and over. And so I'll just finish this by saying that the congressman from Colorado that I talked to, I asked him, what's the meaning of this? And he thought for a long time, and he was a white man, and there were tears coming down his eyes, and he said, when I looked out at that sea of people, I realized that America has come of age. Mm-hmm. And I thought, bingo, that was a perfect remark. So it was really something. But the educational element is something I want to talk about today, which is texts. There are texts. This is a text. The speech that Barack Obama gave was a text, 18 minutes, 2,400 words. But this moment was also a text. And one of the things that's happened in our lifetime is that education has moved from looking at texts almost exclusively as printed words on a page to texts in a much broader sense of cultural acts, film, video games, etc. In other words, our concept of text is widening dramatically, and yet it's my conviction that our educational systems are still largely locked in the old printed text, and until that transition is made, I think there's going to be a certain awkwardness in our educational systems. So that to turn it back to you.
Well, that will tie into what we're talking
right.
about. But I'd like to go back to the inauguration.
Okay.
Though. Would you share? I'm sure people are interested in what you talked about to the gathering that day.
Well, it's of such little importance that I hate to even spend any time on it. I was Thomas Jefferson, so I just said these were basically incoming freshman congressmen, and I said, 2 terms only and retire as fast as you can. So this was just like one of those ads where it goes in one ear, it's straight out the other. They looked on me politely as if I were an alien who didn't understand America. So, I said what Jefferson would say. I mean, when Jefferson was inaugurated on March 4th, 1801, there were 3,500 people living in the District of Columbia. And at his inauguration, there were a total of 1,000 people. There was no parade. He walked to his inauguration. He was staying in a boarding house called Conrad and McMunn's, about 200 yards from the unfinished Capitol building. It was just the Senate chamber then. The city was brand new. The street, the mile and a half between the Capitol and the White House was literally mud. Pennsylvania Avenue was literally mud, and there were still stumps and pigs rooting in the streets. It was just a wilderness, a howling wilderness, with the White House at one end and this beginning of the national capital at the other. And Jefferson walked from this boarding, he was staying at a boarding house during the transition, and he walked over and took the oath of office and delivered the second greatest inaugural address in American history. And then when he finished, he walked back to the boarding house, and they had a group table, and he had been sitting in the worst chair at this group table for the transition period. That was very Jefferson, not to take prime of place ever. And he went straight back to that chair, and one of the people said, "Well, don't we now yield to you, Mr. President?" And he said, no, I'm the same farmer scientist that I was this morning. So if you contrast that, a total of 1,000 people, the most modest president in American history, and yet maybe the greatest writer, and the greatest political thinker. And then 2 million people, every news network in the world, parties, people, some of the parties cost $500,000, $1 million, $2 million. It's just a whole different world. And then the short answer to all that is that we are not Mr. Jefferson's republic in any meaningful sense of the term. And so I went because someone invited me to go, and that helped to defray my expenses, but I had absolutely nothing to contribute.
Well, we differ with you on that, but where were you during the inauguration? Could you see anything, or were you?
Oh yeah, I had one of the best seats in the world. We were in this restaurant called Charlie Palmer's Steakhouse on the corner of Connecticut and First, which was closer to the Capitol steps than almost anybody, and we had 25-foot windows and giant television screens and a balcony we could go stand on, and we could walk in and out, and it was a very privileged group.
So you weren't freezing.
I was the least of them, but we also had television and everything else. And I'll just tell you one funny story about this. These were largely non-Bushites, let's call them. And two things happened when George Bush was introduced on the Capitol dais. There was a very significant boo that went up from the crowd, which you didn't hear on television, and then they began to sing, "Na na 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 na, goodbye," and it seemed a little rude to me. It didn't seem very Jeffersonian. But then later, when it was all over and the president's helicopter took off, in the group that I was in of about 800 people, there was a sustained cheer when the former president left, and it was not a "well done, Mr. President" cheer. So it was both a historic event, and yet in many respects it was a partisan event. And I actually thought that detracted a little from the dignity of the thing.
So do you think, and we'll get into the topic of the day here in just a minute, but I find this very...
You're leading. You said you have to keep me on track.
Let's just go into the future 25 years. Do you think that sort of negativity towards George Bush is going to remain? Or do you think, Harry Truman, when he left, wasn't a very popular guy? And today we look back on him with a lot of nostalgia.
Well, that should give us some humility in the face of a question like that, because Harry Truman was reviled in his time and regarded as a non-entity, and his stature has risen almost every year since, until he's now regarded as not one of the greats, but one of the near greats. So we don't know, Larry, but I'll just venture a guess that history will be relatively stern towards George Bush, that his presidency will be regarded not necessarily as a failure, but as insufficiently integrated. In other words, I don't think, this is really about communication. Barack Obama is a born communicator. Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. Thomas Jefferson, maybe our greatest writer. Great presidents find the language that enables the country to get on board with their vision. And I think that for whatever reason, that's not George Bush's character set, and in some sense it's not his skill set either. And so he never was able to make the case that he wanted to make to us about his vision of the world. He may be vindicated. I have some doubts about that. But if he were going to be vindicated, it would have been better had he been a more eloquent spokesman for the view of the world that he sees. And I mean, if you look at Tuesday as one of the pivotal days in American history, today was too. President Obama, by executive order, forbade torture under any internationally accepted definition of that term hereafter. And I think that that is going to have an enormous effect. It may prove in time that George Bush did what he did in the wake of 9/11 for very good and compelling reasons, but there is a palpable sigh of relief in the country that we are returning to more normal American values. But the jury's still out. We'll see if Barack Obama can maintain security under the Geneva Conventions. I think it's really too early to make judgments about this, but the country is ready for George Bush to go home. There's no question about that, and Washington was thrilled.
Last question on the inauguration, and we'll get on this. Give me your sense of the speech.
I've been writing about this. In fact, if anyone's interested, and give me your email, I'll send it to you, because I've been writing this essay for the North Dakota Humanities Council newsletter, and it's gone way, way, way too long, and so now I don't know what to do with it, but it's about Lincoln's second inaugural address. I think the greatest inaugural address in American history is Lincoln's second on March 4th, 1865. The second greatest is Thomas Jefferson's on March 4th, 1801. Third, maybe FDR. Fourth, maybe JFK. Fifth, Jefferson's second inaugural address. But without any question in my mind, Lincoln's second is not only the greatest inaugural address, but arguably the greatest thing ever written in America. I mean, it's also one of the shortest. The longest inaugural address was by William Henry Harrison. It was 8,445 words. It took almost 2 hours to read. It was a very cold day in Washington, and he died 1 month later of pneumonia. A kind of a lesson for the long-winded. The shortest inaugural address in American history was George Washington's second inaugural address, which was March 4th, 1793. It was 135 words long, and he basically said, if you don't know me by now, I got nothing further I have to explain to you, So the shortest, George Washington. Longest, William Henry Harrison. I would have thought Theodore Roosevelt would be right up there in the long. It's not. His was only 900 some words, very short. Barack Obama was 2,300 and some. Lincoln, 701 words. And I just invite everyone to read it. It is truly magnificent for a whole range of reasons. And one of them was its brevity and the amount of meaning he packed in to that occasion. And so that added more significance to Tuesday, because Barack Obama was being sworn in on the Bible that Abraham Lincoln swore his oath of office on. So, I mean, really powerful symbolism. But what did I think of the inaugural address? I thought it will not be remembered as one of the great inaugural addresses in American history. I thought it was adequate. It had some great moments. If you will, we'll shake your hand if you will open your fist. Mm-hmm. What he said about himself, my grandfather might not have been served in a restaurant in this town. I think his belief that it's time to stop torturing and get back in the international community. Lots of good doctrine in the speech, but I didn't think it was a great speech. I don't think the country really cared, but here's what I would say is the nut of it, Larry, that if Barack Obama is a transformative figure, and who knows quite what that means, he now has a really serious transformation he has to undertake, because it's one thing to inspire the electorate, it's another thing to turn the Titanic of Titanics that is America's government. So I was looking for an inaugural address of the Lincoln, Kennedy, Reagan, Jefferson sort that would lift us to a higher level of American aspiration, so that I thought that was his only chance really to lift the Titanic off the iceberg that it's on and move us forward. So I was actually a little disappointed, but that didn't detract from the overall thrill of being there. But I read it on the plane coming back last night, and I don't think it reads, well, it's not Lincoln-esque, let's say that.
Do you think he was concerned about raising expectations too high, too quickly?
I don't know. I think he missed the mark. I mean, undoubtedly there are many, many pressures that are occurring in something like this, and he needed to show that he wasn't just lofty rhetoric and that substance and so on. And he also wanted to speak a little sternly about where we are. And he said, quoting St. Paul, it's time for us to put aside childish things. And I mean, it was a little bit schoolmasterish, I think, and a little on the stern side. I think what he missed was that aspiration is the moment, that this is your moment to say it's dawn in America. Jefferson said, a wide and fruitful country with room enough for the 100th and the 1,000th generation. That sort of language is, in some personal way, is what people expect. So I think that what I would have done if I had been writing it would have been to connect the dots. And if you read my newspaper column on Sunday, it'll have a little of this, so I apologize. But Thomas Jefferson, our apostle of liberty, was a slaveholder. And he wrote in Notes on Virginia that he advanced it as a suspicion only that black people were inferior to whites in body and mind. 8 of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders. Washington, D.C. was built by slaves in land carved out of slave states of the Upper South. The capital was placed there at the insistence of the Southern aristocrats, Jefferson, Washington, Monroe, Madison, to protect slavery in part, to have the capital of the nation not in New England or New York, but in the Upper South where slavery was still important. Lincoln, the great emancipator, was more interested in union than emancipation, and he was a repatriationist. He actually believed that black people should be freed eventually and repatriated in Africa. If you just read American history, if he had connected these dots, that the symbolism of his being there is about this long, agonizing journey we've been on that's not over yet, and he is one important player in that, but that this is a place, this is a tradition in which race and slavery have been just tragically involved, and his election and inauguration is in some sense proof that we can overcome. I think that would have shot it through the roof. That's what I would have urged him to do, is to talk about that place, that scene, that capital, and the founding fathers, who were great men, but who couldn't extricate themselves from this thing. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it's not for me or you. What did you think of it, the inaugural address?
I thought I got to ask the questions.
I'm turning the lens here. What did you think of it?
Well, no, I was disappointed as well. I expected more of the shades of Lincoln and Martin Luther King in it, mm-hmm. and I didn't sense that when I listened to it. A couple takeaways, and that was it. There wasn't any "ask not what your country can do for you." The thing that you really wanted to hold on and that you could see on plates hanging on walls, there wasn't anything like that.
No plate talk.
Yeah, no plate talk, and so I was a little disappointed in that. But okay,
with the remaining few minutes.
For the remaining few minutes of today, we'll get into the topic. Thank you very much, Clay. It was a historic event, and we appreciate the fact that you got to go there and have come back and shared that with us. And we're all sort of enjoying the moment, but we were watching it on television. It was nice and warm in the classrooms and all that sort of stuff, but thank you very much. Appreciate that. The topic for today, however, the title of this is An Educational Curriculum for the 21st Century, Baby Boomers and the Post-Literate Generations. And in giving this topic to us, you said that you would talk about the importance of the life of the mind in a learning society. So I know you're going to have some opening comments, so why don't you go ahead with comments.
I might dispense with most of that. Let me just quote a passage from the inaugural address.
Okay.
Because when I heard it, I immediately thought of you. Here's what President Obama said. We will return science to its rightful place and wield technology's wonders to raise health care quality. A few sentences later, we will harness the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories, and we will transform our schools and colleges and universities to meet the demands of a new age. It's a generality, but he's saying exactly what we're talking about. In other words, the sense he gave, and you know, if you have 2,394 words to spend, you have to spend them very carefully. Foreign policy and the problems of the economy and so on and so forth. Somebody convinced him, or he convinced himself, that education and science needed to be in this inaugural address, and he says we will transform our schools and colleges and universities to meet the demands of a new age. And that's the theme that I began thinking about this with, that our curriculum is a great one. It dates back to Horace Mann and Thomas Dewey and all the way back to Cicero, really. But the question is, does the curriculum that we've all sort of inherited really prepare our young people for the 21st century? And that's how I want to start. And I'll start by asking you a question. But if you take a kind of a putative young person in North Dakota, let's take someone like Brian Smith of rugby, who is now 17 or 18 years old, or Jill Smith of rugby. If that person comes to a college and will graduate in 2012, what do we really want Jill or Brian to know to be able to get along in and thrive in the world that they're going to inherit? And I think if you start that way and say, well, what's the outcome you're looking for? What's the skill set? What's the knowledge base? What's the sense of perspective? What's the kind of the mental infrastructure that we provide that will enable that person to thrive in North Dakota, in the United States, and in the world in the 21st century? I think if you start that way, you really start questioning what it is we think we're doing. So let me ask you, just to start, do you think that the sort of hodgepodge curriculum that we've all inherited and seldom challenge is doing an adequate job of preparing people not only for the challenges of the 21st century, but keeping in mind our friends who are on televideo today, for the job skills and the capacities needed for the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, that's a question that we're struggling with. One of the things that we've been talking about and blogging about and reading and having discussions about is what's the disruptive innovation that's going to come along in education that's really going to change higher education. And that, to me, it gets at exactly what you're asking. What do they need to know? Now, we've sort of all signed up for the fact that we have this general education curriculum. They're going to get some communications and English and some math and some social science, and we sort of do that. And across the board, there's this agreement that everybody kind of has to get that, and then they specialize in something. And for us, as a school that does both liberal arts and technical programs, and that's when they're specializing into their whatever the technology is that they're studying, or they go in the liberal arts, and then the hope is that they will go on and get their four-year degree at some point. So I think there is an agreed upon curriculum. The problem is, of course, that curriculum goes back into the industrial age. We still have industrial age education, and sort of believe that folks had to have that rounding mechanism, if you will, that intellectually rounded them as people before they got their specialty and then move forward with that. So what do they need to know? I don't have the answer what they need to know for the 21st century. I know that we're still teaching them what we believe they needed to know in the 20th century in sort of our industrial age. And so I'm hoping today you'll crack that nut for us.
I have no way to crack it. I don't really know what I'm talking about. This isn't my area. I mean, I just showed up, but I'm actually hoping for a conversation where we can really explore this. But let me just offer you some propositions. I don't think that, I've taught off and on again through my entire career, and I remember two things when I taught at the University of Nevada. I taught a Western traditions course, which began with the Bible and Homer and Virgil and Greek plays and so on. And the first book that was assigned, well, the second book, first we read texts from the Bible, but then I assigned Homer's Iliad in the Richmond Lattimore translation. And I was walking across campus, and this male student was talking to his girlfriend on a telephone, and he said, I won't quote what he said, but basically he was saying, what kind of a complete idiot would think that this book matters to a person who wants an education? And and he was right and he was wrong. Obviously, I think the Iliad is one of the world's most important texts. On my top 10 list, it's there. And at one point in my life, I actually learned enough ancient Greek to read it. I couldn't do that today, but I'm a big believer in the high humanities and the core texts and the great classics, and I'll try to make the case for that today. But I also was on his side because here he had come from a high school in Elko or Reno or Las Vegas, and he had had a smattering of this and a smattering of that, and he was in no way prepared to read the Iliad. I mean, he was at sea with the Iliad. He might have been able to read My Antonia or Huckleberry Finn or Their Eyes Were Watching God, but to take on one of the world's most complicated texts as a poetic text with names he had never heard of, with places he barely had heard of, there was nothing I could do as the professor to provide enough toolkit, resource base for him to have that experience, because we no longer prepare our 17 and 18-year-olds for that moment. And so the college is still trying to hold up this idea of the humanities and the sciences, and it's bringing in people increasingly less well trained, not less intelligent, not less thoughtful or curious or anything else, just less well prepped for that moment. And so I thought, this is nuts to do this. You know, the second story is teaching Faulkner's Light in August. I had actually never read Faulkner's Light in August, and I read it the summer before I taught it, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. And I made one of the worst pedagogical mistakes of my life when I was teaching it. It's a crowd about 4 times this large in this big lecture theater, and I said, you know, you're about to read William Faulkner's Light in August. It's one of the greatest novels ever written. It's just extraordinarily rich in every possible way. But here's the thing, it's probably going to take you 40 or 50 hours to read it. And I was, of course, underestimating what it actually takes. But when I said that, waves of contempt and derision went through the room. And I lost 800 students right then. I mean, most of them thought, no way, 40 or 50 hours? Are you insane? If I had said, you know, you should read it, you probably read it in a couple of nights, they might have started and then gotten into it and been drawn through. But I ruined it for them by saying, this is going to take a week of your intellectual energy. And they just didn't have that to spend. You know, we don't live in that age anymore. The pace of our lives is too frenetic. And so if we're going to keep the high humanities, if we're going to have people read Chaucer and Homer and Milton and Twain and My Antonia and this and that, we have to find a better set of resources to surround that experience. But just giving the Iliad to some Brian from Rugby and saying, go back to your room and read this book, is, I think, a broken idea. And it's not only a broken idea, Larry, it's contemptuous, because you're saying, it's like telling me, well, why don't you run the marathon this morning? You know, I'm not going to. I'm going to fail at mile 3. And so if you set me up to fail at mile 3, now I'm going to not only fail, which is a terrible thing to do to any student, but I'm also going to feel like a failure and lose confidence in myself. So why would we do this? Take a freshman and give them Light in August. Take a freshman and give them War and Peace, when we're not creating the contextual basis for that to be a successful thing. That's my main concern about where we are with the curriculum.
Now, it sounds to me like you're criticizing, because this conversation about the humanities in college always turns out to be a criticism of K-12.
It's not K-12, it's K-culture. Our culture is not there anymore. You know, my daughter is a very intelligent young lady. I'm sure she's not gifted in any sense, but she's intelligent. Her days consist of watching CNN and playing video games and doing Facebook and MySpace and taking digital photographs and texting endlessly. You know, you get like a $600 cost overrun on texting alone per month, and and I mean, and I'm not trying to criticize that. Her world is not sitting in a rocking chair reading Jane Eyre. So we have to face the world as it is, not as we think it used to be. And so I don't think it's K-12. I think it's the culture. And it's not just that we're dumbing down. Of course we're dumbing down. There's no question about that, but that's not my concern. We've just changed our lens. And so let me give you a kind of a radical proposition. Instead of asking a college sophomore to write a paper about Hamlet, which I think is just, in a sense, a knuckleheaded thing to do now. Every college student should learn how to make a website. Every college student should learn how to post something on YouTube. Every college student should learn how to make a video. Every college student should learn how to edit audio, to negotiate the new world of intellectual tools, because like it or not, that's where our culture is. And so why wouldn't we want, when you leave college, you're never writing a paper about Hamlet again. That's for sure. But you're probably building a website, you're probably creating a PowerPoint, you're probably editing video. So why wouldn't we ask where the interface is between people and their culture today, and teach them the skill set to do that paper, rather than a paper that Cicero might have wanted on Julius Caesar.
So you're saying instead of swimming against the current of the technological changes that we're experiencing right now, turn around and swim with the current.
And it's not just giving up and saying that's where the world is, it's actually a breathtakingly exciting world. I mean, if you, for example, said, I could see a course in which you assigned Hamlet. Hamlet's one of the world's greatest pieces of literature, but we will soon have electronic books where you can be reading Hamlet. But you could also push a button and go from reading it to listening to it. Or you push another button and go from listening to it to watching it in a video. If you come to a term like zoons, or forsooth, or marry, one of the kind of weird Renaissance and Elizabethan terms in Shakespeare, you could push another button and it would give you an audio definition of that word. You would see different ways in which the play has been staged. All key terms and elements would have explanatory notes. So it would be like Cliff Notes for adults in the YouTube age. So that every time you come to something that trips up a student, there would be resource base there to help them. We didn't have that when I was going to college. You sat alone in a room with Hamlet and you either came out or you didn't. But we were still a largely textual society back then. But now we have these marvelous tools. So why wouldn't we create an educational model which brought all of that to bear on the play Hamlet? If we do that, then we can still keep people reading that great text with these auxiliary aids. And that's what I would want to do. I mean, if you said to me, design a course, I would say, let's bring every facet of the electronic world to bear on this traditional text, so that no one gets tripped up. Because here's what happens. You're taking pre-calc, and you're taking a PE course, and you're in an engineering class, and you're in accounting, and you're in a literature class. And you've got all this stuff to do, plus you have a life. And so you're reading along in the Odyssey, and you get to page 4, and there's something like, and then Hephaestus built a hecatomb. And you think, who is Hephaestus and what's a hecatomb? If you are a busy college student, that might be enough alone to trip you out of the book. But if you had these aids right then to get you across that in not only a useful way, but maybe even an entertaining and engaging way, that would solve a problem. And so I think we must keep War and Peace in our curriculum, and we must keep Dante's Inferno. But there's no reason that we ever again have to put a student alone in a room with that text. That's my point. We should take advantage of this. It's not a surrender. It's a joyous inclusion of new possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, so back to what I just said about swimming the stream. I'm not saying give up. You're saying let's go with it. Let's turn around. Let's go with the technology. Let's get the technology engaged and all that sort of stuff. And I agree, the multimedia aspect of education today is tremendous, the capabilities of multimedia. What a marvelous textbook you just described there.
Easy to do, Larry.
Hitting the buttons and getting definitions and seeing the video and all that sort of stuff.
And in the course, instead of reading 10 books, I would rather teach my students to read 1 or 2 books this way. And then say, instead of writing an essay or having an exam, now take Hamlet and do something with it. Create a video or a panache of different film versions of it, or who knows what, but do a newscast about Hamlet having just killed Claudius. Whatever you chose to do, but do something really creative and on the edge of where our culture is, because our culture is no longer, it was a myth to say we're post-literate. We're not post-literate. but we are literate plus. And the plus has to be brought right into the center of education. It happens. Your professors are already doing this in their classes with smart classrooms and so on. But it has to go from the master using these tools in class like some sort of an alchemist to the student having access to those tools in her study or in her house or at a coffee shop or where she is. And there's no reason that this can't be routinely available now. It's just we haven't committed ourselves to it yet. Now, I also think that the curriculum needs to be adjusted, but to the extent that we have a humanities curriculum, I'll just give you an example. You and I are both reading Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is one of my favorite authors. I dropped my daughter off at Christmas and I was feeling really melancholy. And so I thought, I'll read a really dark book. And I loved Crime and Punishment, and so I bought a copy of Crime and Punishment and I read it. And it just, the thing about great books is they're newly great every time you read them. This is probably the 8th or so time I've read this novel. And you get stuck on the Russian names, and there's a lot of stuff about St. Petersburg. And as I went along, I just marked in the margins of the book every time that I would add another element. If he's talking about a bridge over the Neva River in St. Petersburg, I'd have a picture of the Neva River right there. And if he's talking about the police headquarters where he's being interrogated, I would have a painting by Edvard Munch of a police headquarters. But I would go through that text and put asterisks at every point where value added could easily be added to make that a better experience for anybody who reads it. You who know how to do all this, or a 17-year-old who's just learning how to do this. And it struck me as insane that we don't just routinely do that.
Why don't we?
If you would just give me the money, I'll do it. Yeah. Well, people are doing it. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I don't pretend I'm inventing any ideas here. I'm just saying that it's time for us to stop believing that a great text is like spinach, that it's just good for you and you should suffer while you read it. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true anymore.
Yeah. I think it's the very first chapter of Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky says that mankind most fears the first step. That's on the very first chapter.
Well, and of course, the first step for him is going to be to murder an innocent person.
That's right. So what would be the first step to move to this world? Or do you think we're well past that we're, the discussion about the humanities and the facts that we're still buying paper books and we're doing all that sort of stuff? Or have we taken the first step, or what would be our first step?
I think, what's so interesting is that students are taking the first step. They're way more savvy than we are and way more creative, and they are a student who's serious. Not all students are serious about, I might not be serious about biochemistry and you might not be serious about philosophy. Each person, as you say, chooses a focus, and the curriculum fulfillment requirements are often a real drag. But if the student is serious, the student is already doing some of this. Now what I would suggest you do is create a college within the college where you feature this sort of thing and turn your best professors, your most creative professors, loose with funds and tech help and so on to try to build some of this, and then see what the effect is. See, how hard that is, how expensive that is, whether that actually increases anything. I would reduce the number of courses. I would create an integrated studies program, and there are all sorts of first steps, but the first step, in my opinion, would be to create a few sample courses. And I'm not talking about just minimal tech courses like online or so on, but a few sample multi-faceted, multimedia, big toolkit courses, and see what the strain is on your personnel and what the satisfaction value is among students. I'd start there, and if it works, which I think it would, and I'd get students involved to teach the faculty how to do these things. Mm-hmm. Then I'd start inviting it across the curriculum, that every course should engage in this sort of thing. That'd be my first step on this front.
Mm-hmm. The Kindle, as you were talking about that, I was thinking, what is it, Amazon Kindle? Is that the right? to enhance that, as you've talked about, I think would, so maybe we can get Amazon to pay for this. Because when you said resource it, I saw all the faculty out here, their ears just perked right up because they're always interested in whether or not we can resource stuff like this. And that's always, of course, that's always a challenge for a community college is resourcing this stuff. But
it'll happen. I mean, for example, if let's say you're reading Crime and Punishment, why shouldn't you have a text, this electronic text, and the page turner technology is just getting richer and more sensuous every day? So you're reading this in your study, and then you have to go to the office, or you're driving to Dickinson for a meeting. You should be able to push a button and it goes straight to audio, and now it's being read to you, if where possible, by the author, him or herself. And so, I mean, these things are not out of the realm of technical possibility. They just haven't yet been brought to bear. But if you think of where we were 10 years ago, imagine an iTouch today compared to what was conceived 10 years ago. In other words, the technologies are just waiting to be applied by people who are turned loose to apply them.
Mm-hmm. What do you see the role as the faculty member in this integrated course that you're talking about with all this technology?
I don't know. I mean, I grew up with the model where the professor was the megaster, was this exalted figure, and the students came to sit at his or her feet and learn. I don't think that's true anymore. I don't think students feel that reverence anymore. I think that we need to create communities of learners. I mean, one of the biggest problems, in my opinion, of education is that we take 30 people who are a natural community and we split them up into 30 discrete units and say, each of you learn. That's not how humans tend to learn. Humans tend to learn in clusters. And so I would stop the perpendicular model of professor and 30 students. I'd say professor and is part of a learning community rather than an expert who has anything to teach. Now when I look at the internet, there's no student in this room who really couldn't educate her or himself without any professor whatsoever. The world is, when you and I were growing up, the professor still really mattered because he or she was kind of a filter through which knowledge passed. Now, any student in this room can go out today and learn anything, and at his or her own leisure, in his or her pajamas or bathrobe or workout clothes or tuxedo for that matter. I mean, I think we have to face the fact that the electronic revolution is going to be much more profound than the Gutenberg revolution, and now instead of teaching people what happened during the Civil War, which is what a professor would do 15 years ago, lecture on the Civil War. I don't think that's necessary anymore. I think now the teacher needs to be a co-learner and go to individual workstations and say, okay, you're looking for something about Lincoln's second inaugural address. Let me help you make good decisions. Let me help you think this through as you are now using these tools. But the doctrine, the data, the matter, the perspectives are all there. It's really a question of creating a critical thinker, a smart user of Wikipedia, a smart user of the internet, rather than passing doctrine down. And if you think about your own education, truly now, when did you graduate from college?
Which time?
Undergraduate.
78.
Okay. Where?
Dickinson.
Okay. What do you remember? Name a piece of historical or literary information that you remember from college.
Oh, this would take too long.
I mean, but you don't remember it. I don't remember anything. That's not what you learn. You don't learn what the Battle of Shiloh was, because you don't have to teach what the Battle of Shiloh was, because anyone here can go find out. Mm-hmm. So why would we teach the Battle of Shiloh? What you learned in college that's still with you is discipline and curiosity and critical thinking skills and ways of seeing and a sophisticated set of perspectives. That's what we need to teach. In other words, it doesn't matter what we teach. In sciences it does, of course, but in the humanities it doesn't really matter what we teach so long as we teach the capacity to go out and learn on your own. Because I don't remember anything that I ever learned from college. All I remember is that I went through it and that it was exciting, and I'm now using some of that in an intuitive way 30 or 40 years later.
When we talked about doing this session, you told me to reread Thoreau, and I did. And
Walden.
Walden, I'm
Right.
sorry. But you told me to reread that, and I did. And particularly, you said pay attention to the pocket knife. And I'm thinking about that as you're talking. And so you want to tie that together?
Well, you tell me what you learned. I mean, you read it.
I did read it. Did you read it?
Yeah, the jackknife you. What does he mean by this?
Yeah. Well, don't put me on the spot. I'm trying to. I'm trying to get at what I think you're describing as the classroom of the future.
Okay, well, what he says basically in Walden is that instead of teaching a student about metallurgy and about stresses and about torque and about mining and so on, teach them how to build a jackknife. If you took all the students at Harvard who have ever taken engineering and metallurgical science, most of them would not really know how to make a jackknife. But if you actually just went out to this group of people and said, each one of you before May needs to build a jackknife, you would actually do better, says Thoreau, because that would be applied knowledge. It would be knowledge that matters in the world. It wouldn't be abstract. Mm-hmm. It would be learning so that you can do things in life and not just build jackknives, but make a deposition in court, give a speech at Rotary. You know, learning skills that have applied values is his point, and that we make a mistake by allowing our curriculum to be as abstract as it is when we would actually teach the same amount but with greater infiltration of the soul if we taught people to apply their knowledge and to learn the things they needed to learn on their way to application. Is that your sense of it?
Well, yeah, and I see that tying right into what you're talking about. You're talking about teaching students how to properly use all the wealth of information that's out there. I guess back to the original question about college, it seems to me when you talk about what you really learn in college, it's almost, you know, I would be very careful about saying this because I do remember some of the lessons I had at Dickinson State in history. And
sure.
Yeah, I do. But to be a historian, I really learned how to do that in graduate school, and not even for a master's degree. I was in my PhD program before I really learned how to do that. And at that point, that's when, what do you have? You have a graduate advisor. You have your dissertation advisor who sits in the office and nods knowingly every now and then sends you on your way again. So you basically do
self-learning.
it yourself. So you're saying move that sort of learning that we have now moved or now resides at the PhD level, you're saying let's bring that right down into the classroom.
Except, I mean, yes, in a sense, but you're saying that your supervisor is an occasional figure that you go and that's not how I would do it. I'd have the professor be a fellow learner. So let me just give you two examples, and you and I have talked about this before, but you know, these are just random. Here's a cell phone, and here's a bottle of water. If you went into a class, if you, Professor Larry Scogan, were teaching a class in the new magic Bismarck State, I just hold up this cell phone and say, okay, your job in this semester is to explain how we got here. What made this possible? What is a cell phone? What's its purpose? How did it evolve? And then that could involve plastics and electronics and the telegraph, the telephone, the internet. I mean, in other words, if a student spent a semester just trying to figure out how we got here to the miniaturization of a computer, basically, this is a phone, a video camera, a still camera, a text device, a telegraphic device, an email, you know, a GPS unit. How did we get here? A student who had to answer that question and had your help every time she or he got stuck would learn more, I think, than taking a course in the history of communication, because this would be a problem to be solved. Or if you took this one, how did we get here? I mean, if I'm not a scientist, if you said to me right now, explain plastic, explain transparent plastic, I couldn't do it. I know that it has something to do with oil, and that's all I know, Larry. I have no idea, and yet I know that this is really bad for the planet. So if you said to me, your job this semester is to explain how we got here, it would be When did bottled water become a norm? When did we use oil for this purpose? How do you distribute this? This was probably bottled in California or maybe in France. How did that get distributed here? What kind of a transportation infrastructure made this happen? What sort of a fuel economy made this happen? How does capitalism work across vast spaces? Why would someone in North Dakota want to drink water from Sri Lanka? How did the cover get designed? I mean, that's the screw top cover. I mean, all these things are really interesting, and this would be a course in itself. What's the barcode? Why do we have nutritional facts on a bottle of water? What kind of government is it that requires a nutritional label on a bottle of water? And the easy thing would be for a libertarian to say, "Oh, that's nonsense," but it's not. This is part of an evolution of government protection of consumers and so on. So to explain this bottle would take a semester. But instead, we do the bottle now and the cell phone next and the Civil War on the third day and War and Peace on the fourth and Chaucer and calculus, and we take a young mind and we split it up into a whole series of tiny little discrete temporary moments. But that's not an integrated way of seeing the world. And if you said to me, and I'm now 54 years old almost, and I would say I'm a pretty well-educated person, but if you said to me, explain how a cell phone works, I couldn't say 5 sentences. If you said to me, tell me about quantum mechanics, I couldn't give you 5 sentences. I mean, if I gave you a list of the number of things that I couldn't give you 5 intelligent sentences about, it would be tedious and endless. But I know almost nothing about my world, and yet I'm absolutely dependent upon it. And so when somebody like Al Gore says, the planet is dying, I literally don't know how to evaluate that. When I come out of college, I should know how to evaluate a statement like that, rhetorically, politically, economically, environmentally, historically. So we're not creating citizens, that's a Jeffersonian critique, and we're not creating consumers, that's a capitalist critique, and we're not creating critical thinkers in our system. And so I would just say, let's toss it and try something else.
Anybody in favor of that?
I'm all alone
I
here.
see hands. Yeah, see some hands up.
You see the point I'm making. I don't know that I have anything of any insight here, Larry, but I think I'm on to some questions that we need to be asking.
I would like Clay to describe, Clay and I were out the other night and sitting at a table, and we thought of an experimental class, and when we started talking about it, it just sort of took on a life of its own,
and
it
you
sounded
liked it
like
then.
a lot of fun.
Yeah, you loved it.
It was great.
Of course, we were drinking heavily, but that's not true.
No, for the students here, that is not
That's
true.
not true.
That is not true.
We were drinking bottled water.
We were drinking bottled water that has 0 calories.
No, we were at a restaurant, and you said, let's talk about our lecture.
Yeah, and
I said,
let's
what if we
describe a class?
And I did this actually this morning. I was going to ask you if you wanted to do it, but I know that you're a busy college president. What I would do, another way to do a class would be to walk in on day 1 and say to every student, all right, how many of you have access to a digital camera, which is now pretty much everybody, but not everybody. So how many of you have access to a digital camera? And anyone who didn't, you give them a lone camera and say at 9:01 tonight, I want you to take a picture of whatever you're doing within some limits. I remember we had the within some limits moment there. Yeah.
We had to set limits on it.
But within some limits. At 9:01, take your camera out and take a picture of what you're doing and bring it to class. And then you get whoever's the techno wizard in the class suddenly puts all those photographs on a computer, and you go through them one by one in the class. And you say, okay, Jill Smith, your picture is of a bowling alley, and Larry, your picture was of a billiard table, and Frank, your picture was of a taxidermy experiment, whatever it is. And then you say to the student, your semester is now to explain this scene. So when we were at this restaurant, there was a wooden table, but it had a kind of formica sort of top. There were bottles, and there were plastic glasses, and there was silverware, and there was There were linens that were partly cotton and partly polyester, and there was pasta and so on. I mean, salt and pepper. But if you actually had to do a reading of that table we were at, why pepper and where does it come from? And what's the history of the spice trade? Salt. Why do humans salt their food? Why did the restaurant choose a wooden table rather than a plastic or metal one? Why does it serve wine in this kind of a glass? Why is a wine glass shaped like that and not like a tumbler? How did the Italians develop so many different types of pasta, and why? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, why do we need so many types of noodle? It's all noodle. But if you had to do a reading of that picture, whatever it was, a bowling alley, a speech tournament, the Colbert Report is on in the background, someone's playing pinochle. If you had to do pinochle would be interesting. If you go to Southern California and say pinochle, it doesn't immediately bring up a picture because they're not Nordics like us. Pinochle doesn't mean anything in Seattle. So if you did a read, it has to be a complex material, cultural, sociological, economic, environmental, gender, literary read of that scene. That would be a semester, and it would be exciting. If I had to explain to you why this computer has a metal cover and where this metal comes from and how it ever got cheap enough to put on a computer, that would take me a number of days. So everything on that table would then lead to a kind of a sociological read of Bismarck, North Dakota in January of 2009 at 9:01 p.m. on such and such an occasion, and that would lead in every direction that would lead. So the student might on the third day get to a problem. Well, where does glass come from? And then you'd say, well, Professor X down in Engineering 203 is an expert on the history of glass. Go talk to her. And so this would be a kind of a discovery where you'd keep going to different people and learn the things you need to move on. Yeah. Does that still seem interesting to you?
Incredibly, and for the faculty, we wanted to say that you would be the resource then in a class like this if
but not
it's
alone.
Mathematics or science or history, whatever, or art. Students would then come and say, okay, I've got this problem, I've got to explain this, and where do I start? And the faculty would be in a position to guide them into where they would go and put that all together. It just sounds incredibly. And Clay and I have been talking too. I've been reading a book called Brain Rules. And,
on audio you've been reading it.
Yeah. Very good. And the guy talks about how we know, you take all the scientists that work in brains, and we know so much about the brain, so much more today than we did in the 1950s or 60s when many of us were in school. Today we know so much more about the functioning of the brain and when it works the best and when it doesn't. And we just know all this information, and we haven't translated any of that into the classroom. And he says, for example, that the 50-minute classroom, he said, we know that, and every faculty member out here knows this, after about 20 minutes, brains start shutting off in the classroom.
But what about the students?
What?
It was just a little joke.
Just
Sorry.
a little joke.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's suggesting that, why do we still run 50-minute classes or 55-minute classes, depending on, why do we still do that when we know that after 20 minutes, now I know some of the classes do that already, and you've got labs and you do some of the lecture and you go into, but guys like Mike McCormick, for example, will stand up in front of a class and long after the brains have shut off, and he's still talking.
No.
And
I happen to know that that's not true. I have a mole in one of his
You've
classes.
got a mole in his class right now? Okay. But, so at any rate, he's asking, and it really leads back to what you're talking about, is that if we were to take that sort of experiment and applied that experiment to what we know about brains and how brains function and what a classroom really ought to look like. And one of the arguments in this book is that if we wanted to design the perfect classroom that went against everything we know about the brain, we would have what we have today. Desks sitting there and the whiteboard up in front, and that would be the perfect thing to shut off the brain, because in reality, and Clay already mentioned this, that humans sort of like to cluster and they like to work, problem solve together, and yet and that happens in classes. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but typically we have sort of this lecture mentality of standing, you teach as you were taught. And I'm one that has spent many years in the classroom standing up in front with the dog-eared notes and lecturing about the Civil War or whatever the case might be. But the reality is that that's probably not the best way to teach and probably not the best way for
So
students
I mean,
to
the
learn.
question this guy raises is, if you know this is a broken system and that not only doesn't have the result you're looking for, but everything we know about neurophysiology and brain function tells you that it can't work. Why do you continue to cling to it when the science has shown that it's a problematic and maybe bankrupt model?
Right.
So what's your answer to that?
Well, my answer is that we're going to have to change. I don't think, and I know that the faculty out here know that I've been talking about, and I've mentioned earlier today, this disruptive innovation. Something in higher education, and I'm not smart enough to know what it is. I know these folks are. I'm not smart enough to know what that is, but something in higher education is going to create that environment I think that you've described, where we're using all of that technology and moving forward and teaching students what they need to know. You know, industry tells us that what they tell us that the products, if you will, of our educational institutions, what they need to do is they need to have critical thinking skills, as you've already talked about. They need to have communication skills. They need to have cross-cultural understanding, because the America that you described at the inauguration is where we're going as a country, and people have to have that, and you know, globally, we have to have that cross-cultural stuff, and they have to have computer and technology literacy. And we know that, and industry tells us that. And so how's the best way to get to that? It remains the challenge. So I think we are going to change. I think our classrooms are going to change. I think they're going to look different than they look today. I think our faculty are going to exactly, and some are doing it now. Many are doing it right now. I mean, you know, there's not a faculty member out here to tell you that I have nothing to do with technology.
Of course.
So that
No,
they are into
I'm
that.
not trying to present a critique of the
No,
students
I
or the
don't
faculty, because I know that they're all wrestling with the same
Right.
set of problems, and many are, in their own way, are experimenting with limited tools and limited resources. And so this is not meant to be a critique of Bismarck State, but I remember when we first started talking about a year and a half ago, an article came out about the top 10 community colleges in America. And Bismarck State was not on that list. And you and I both thought, why couldn't it be on that list? And if you did this, I mean, bringing in real people who actually know what they're talking about, instead of you and I just blathering about it. But I mean, if Bismarck State committed itself to becoming this learning community in which the old paradigms were challenged and in some ways broken, and new wild and experimental things occurred that were on the cutting edge, the worst case scenario is that people would vote with their feet and go to Dickinson instead, or you know, that you'd pay a price because people would be too uncomfortable with that kind of disruptive innovation. But the best case scenario is you'd be inventing education in some sense for the 21st century, and the world would come to look at what you're doing and say, wow, some of this works and some of it doesn't, but boy, that works, and now let's try that in Kansas City, or let's try that in Santa Monica.
Right.
Can I change the subject?
Absolutely. We ought to go to some questions from the audience.
I just want to
too,
get two
here
more
pretty
things
soon.
on the
Go ahead.
table. One is, you know, we're talking about Jill Smith from Rugby. What does she need to know? This goes back to our opening discussion of the inauguration. I mean, it is shocking how little America, let's just say, I won't just say this administration that's now leaving, America knew about the following subjects when we invaded Iraq. Iraq.
One.
The history of Iraq. Islam. Islamofascism. Factions within Islam. World War I and its aftermath. Climate. Literature. Museums. In other words, if you asked yourself, if you said to, let's say, President Clinton, Bill Clinton, and he was contemplating invading Afghanistan, if you said to him, Mr. President, in the best of all possible worlds, what would the United States know before it invades Afghanistan? You'd get an answer. Who's invaded them before? How do they respond to invasion? What does an occupying army do? What's the climate like in the long run? What's the supply line, et cetera. You would ask a whole series of questions. It is quite clear that we did not ask those questions. Now, they may have been asked in think tanks or at universities, but they weren't asked in the places where the power decisions were made. My daughter is 14, whenever she asks me about college, I say Arabic. Learn Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, or learn Arabic, if you really want to write your own ticket in this century. And we're no longer Fortress America. We need global studies. I mean, it seems to me every college student should take global studies. And I don't just mean, you read 10 selections from the Quran. We need global studies in a really significant way. We need to know who we're dealing with here. The two greatest, another way to look at this, to ask the question about Jill and Peter of rugby, is what are the challenges that they're going to face in their adult lives? Well, I can name a few. The Arab Islamic world, a severe restraint on our uses of carbons, either because of supply reasons or environmental catastrophe reasons. China, north-south questions of immigration. The immigration problem is largely have-nots infiltrating the world of the haves to get some of what they have. But if you just start to look at the questions, the challenges that we know we will face in the 21st century, every student who graduates from this institution, or UND or Montana State, should get a toolkit to look at those questions. And one of them is certainly language. I think we made a fundamental error when we jettisoned language requirements in colleges, because we need Arabic speakers, and we need Mandarin speakers, and we need Russian speakers, and we need Hindustani, Spanish, et cetera, et cetera. And so the toolkit has to involve global education, and global education and a monolingual society are automatically a contradiction in terms. And so we should be facing this and saying, we used to be able to get by with thinking that the world was going to speak English, but that's no longer the case. And the world we're going to face is a world in which we need a very significant number of Americans who can speak those languages and know those cultures and know their religions and know their habits and how you shake hands in those cultures and how you pray in those cultures and how you offend in those cultures and how you war in those cultures. So we need global studies in a big integrated way, and not just I take a course in Hindu religion or I take a course in Shia versus Sunni. It has to be holistic. What's the economy of the Middle East? Huntington, the distinguished scholar of world civilization, said that the problem with the Middle East is that you have 30, 40 million people, young men, between the ages of 10 and 25. They're unemployed and they're all alpha males. Well, try that in Bismarck. If every young man in Bismarck between the ages of 10 and 25 was an alpha male, in other words, had to be the king of the pack, and he was unemployed and his family was hungry, and our system of law and order had broken down, this would be mayhem. And so his view was, you can't just look at this in terms of East versus West and Islam versus Christianity. It's really a sociological, economic problem. And it's a climate problem too. The average temperature on any given day in July in the Middle East is 122 degrees. And so that produces a sort of a grumpy young man.
Like minus 44 does here.
Yes. Yeah. That produces a gloomy old man. But my point is global education.
Understand. You said you had 2 points you wanted to make before we moved on.
Yeah, well, I'll give up.
Okay. Now, you put together, I think, a PowerPoint. Did you want to go through any of that?
Yeah, but it's not worth it now.
It's not worth it now?
No.
Okay.
Because that whole digression on the inauguration.
It did it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any questions?
Or challenges. Mike wants to defend
Mike
himself.
McCormick wants to defend himself.
That's from your slur.
Yeah.
I hate to say this, but you're way beyond my 20 minutes ability to keep with you. Way beyond 20
Way beyond 20 minutes. Understand.
Clay, we used to know what an educated man was years ago, 19th century, and an educated man knew what he was too. If you were to form the qualities of a man or woman in the 21st century, what qualities or skills would you give them?
What's the educated young man or woman in the 21st century? Well, I want you to answer that question too.
No chat?
Okay. Well, St. Augustine, the great Christian theologian of the 4th century AD, said that he would regard himself as well educated when he could read anything he wanted to read, write anything he wanted to write, and understand any concept he wanted to understand. I've always thought that's a great definition of being well educated. I'll just say I do not think we're teaching young people to be adequate readers. And you read the Thoreau passage from his chapter Reading, and it's one of the best things. If I were teaching, if I were the president of Bismarck State, I'd have every incoming freshman read that chapter on reading, because what Thoreau basically says is reading isn't something you can just do. Reading is a discipline. You need to bring to bear on it a whole set of sophistications, and they don't come naturally. They're an acquired skill set. But that was Augustine's definition. I would say, to Mike's question, that a well-educated person in 2012 would be able to read the inauguration that just happened from a whole range of different lenses, to read it in terms of race history of the United States, the Constitution, why it mattered, why did Barack Obama do a redo last night of the oath of office? Why does that matter? Was that just window dressing, or was that constitutionally important? To read what happened in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, where there were 2 million people choking the metro system and the taxi system, about urban planning and infrastructure. In other words, you would want someone who could do a read. I think we need to redefine what read is. You need to be able to read a situation, read a historical event, read a place, read a television show. And so I would want the person to have a critical thinking, to be sure, but a toolkit that would enable her or him to provide a thoughtful, nuanced reading of something. So let me give you an example. I was in the Minneapolis airport last night coming back from Washington, D.C., and I was stuck for many hours, and I had a meal in this restaurant, and there was a waiter there, and he saw the redo going on, where Barack Obama redid the oath of office, and it was on mute. And he immediately went into a rant against Barack Obama and said, there's the Messiah. Every time he wants something different, he gets it. He doesn't like the way Roberts did it, so now he forces him. He screwed it up last night, and now Roberts has to pay the price. And he ranted for like 6 minutes. I wanted to say, first of all, you're completely misreading what actually happened here. But second of all, is that all you can bring to this? I mean, all he could bring to this was a kind of a reactionary, red state, anger, wrath, indifference, annoyance, contempt for what happened. But no part of him wanted to say, I wonder what this really means. But he went immediately from a visual thing that he didn't hear to a kind of a Sean Hannity-like rant. I mean, just like, bam, that's what I think about this country. And we see that every day now. People just, wow, that's what liberalism is, and that's what conservatism is, and that's what abortion is, and pro-life and pro-choice. And I mean, have you ever seen anyone just stop Larry and say, I wonder what that means? We need that. We need to teach our young people to stop and to drink it in a little, and to think, okay, I know my reactive lens to this. And I heard someone today saying that idiot Roberts, he should never have been appointed. He can't even read the oath of office. So there's another stupid thing to say. But, they were in front of 2 million people plus 1 billion worldwide. You and I might screw that one up too. But you have all these we all have these reactive responses, every one of us. But we train ourselves to discipline ourselves and pull back and add some extra lenses. So if you read it from the point of view of public address, from kind of a Toastmasters, Rotary point of view, how would you read that moment? If you read it from a constitutional point of view. So we need to teach people to wear more than one lens. And I think the number one way to teach young people to wear more than one lens is to require language study, because the minute you start speaking Spanish or Latin or German, then you have a second lens, and that other lens is automatically a different one. But I would say that's my answer to your question, is that we need to teach people to have the skill sets to read culture. And then we need some specific skills. I mean, obviously we need oil technicians in North Dakota, and clean coal or coal technicians, and air quality. I mean, we need people that have advanced skill sets in very particular ways. But before you get to that, you need to be, I think, what Augustine said was, before you get to be, he didn't know this because he wasn't you know, he lived in the 4th century, but before you're an oil engineer, you also need to be a complete human being, and those two things have to be integrated in our educational system. What would you say?
Well, my response is that's a little idealistic. You know, even in Jeffersonian America, not everybody thought like Thomas Jefferson. And they had, you know, he had these ideals of what an American citizen ought to be, but most American citizens, even in his time, were out, you know, hard scrabble life out someplace. They weren't sitting around reading in Greek and reading in Latin. And so I think most Americans, to answer your question, Michael, I think we need to educate folks to be functional in our society. And to me, I think, you know, if you take Obama's speech and ask most people to read it and then to give sort of a history of the race relations behind that, they would fail miserably. But we still are advancing as a society because I would hope that most people are at least functional in that society. And so I think it's idealistic to hope that we can educate everybody to read that speech and to understand the history behind it. You and I do that. Many people in this room, most people in this room can do that. I don't know who the two aren't that can't, but most people can do this, and so, you know, we consider ourselves able to do that. But I think if you know, all you have to do is watch Jay Leno some night and his people on the street kind of things, and some of that's, I'm sure, very set up. But my God, you're sitting there, they're talking to somebody who's a school teacher, and they ask them a very simple question in American history, and they have no idea. And so all of us would say, well, holy cow, those are easy questions. But I think in the main, when you take the Americans, what I hope for in America at large is that an American citizen can be functional. And functional means that they can contribute to the economic well-being of the country, they can make good decisions, and I'm not saying they have to be the decisions that understand the entire history, but they can make a good I think the American people made a wonderful decision, and this is a political statement, I suppose, but I don't mean it to be, but I think that saying that we're ready to move on, and the American people elected Barack Obama. He won not only the popular vote, but overwhelmingly in the Electoral College. Remember when George Bush was elected, he didn't win, but he won the Electoral College, and that's our system. And so we all had to, as Americans, had to say, okay, he's won, that's the way our system is, and we accept that. So I think overwhelmingly to make those kinds of decisions, that's what I'm asking for. I'm not asking people to know Latin and Greek.
Well, but I'm not either. I think you're making it seem as if I'm making an elitist or idealistic argument. I'm not. I'm saying in any given situation, everybody should be able to look at it with more than one lens. In other words, to say, I wonder how, if you looked at it from John Roberts' point of view, what it looks like. In other words, instead of just being reactive, it doesn't matter, you don't have to say, oh, in the history of classical rhetoric, these things happen.
Right.
You know, but what's another way of looking at it? I think that's a minimal capacity of an educated person, no matter what their education.
Rush Limbaugh was quoted this morning in the paper saying, I hope he fails. Here's somebody talking about the President of the United States. I hope he fails. And think of the people that listen to him. I mean, and that's the problem that you've already alluded to.
The reactive nature.
That reactiveness.
You want to take...
Okay, more questions?
See, maybe we
There must be some. Are there any chat? Oh, there are chat questions.
This is a chat comment, not a question,
Oh, okay.
but Vern thinks BSC ought to hire Clay to rework our curriculum and the way we do things. So.
Hey, go Vern.
Was that from Vern?
Yeah, right.
And
Thank
then,
you, Vern.
And then be a
Vern
model.
will pay for it.
Be a model for the university system.
I don't think that's the answer, but thank you, Vern. You know? I mean, I do think you should hire, with some of the immense money that's coming in, especially now that presidential salaries are under fire, but you should hire somebody, not me, I mean, I don't know anything about this, but somebody who really could be a 21st century cutting edge tech integrated curriculum guru as an advisor to students and faculty. I think that would be a really smart thing to do, because that's one position. And then that person could give little seminars and take his Crime and Punishment and show how it works. And
Right.
you know, I think that would be a really, I don't think I'm that person, but I think that would be a really smart expenditure.
Yeah. And we do have some initiatives, some innovative initiatives going in that way.
I think there was somebody in the back.
Another question? We're going to have to repeat this too, Henry. I said I'm going to have to repeat it so our audience can hear it too.
I'll stand up. I'm probably loud enough that people can hear.
That's good.
You were talking about a lot of the recent research in brain, and one of the comments that you made, and I assume it came from where you read, was that the way we teach is antithetical to everything that we know. My question is, or sort of thought about that is that if that is true, then how did we get where we are now? I mean, obviously people were learning under that system and learning a great deal, or we wouldn't be where we are today. So how do we reconcile, that kind of knowledge? And in part, I'm saying that because I think that's a very put-offish kind of statement to say how we've been doing it for so long is irrelevant, because somehow it's gotten us to where we are today. Where I would like to take that, or at least have a comment about, there must be some skill set of people sitting in an hour lecture, being bored and not paying attention, that they are getting something that allows them then to move on. And what are those skill sets?
You want to repeat that?
Do I want to repeat that whole thing?
Well, just a bit.
No, what Henry was saying for our audience, who teaches psychology, by the way, and so I'm already out of my league. I'm already in trouble because I've commented about the brain, and I've told you everything I know about it already from that book. But basically the question is, or the statement, the comment, which is a valid comment, is that, well, if we've been doing it so wrong, then how can we be where we're at today? I mean, obviously, success, demonstrated success shows that we've been doing something right, and I certainly agree with that. However, I would add to that, and again, everything I know about the brain I've already said. So, but I will say that I think athletics shows me, we have people now that swim faster and faster, and people that run faster and faster, and people that jump higher and higher. I mean, our athletes today, if you were to competitively put athletes of today against athletes of the 1960s or 70s or something, we would find out that the athletes today are far, far better. Well, they're using science and technology to show them how to run faster, how to breathe better, how to jump higher, how to do all that sort of stuff. All that is computerized. They hook them up to all sorts of electrodes, and they say, well, if you run this way as opposed to that way, if you put your foot down differently, you will gain 1/10 of a second, and that's all it takes is 1/10 of a second. So it doesn't mean that we weren't running well in the 60s and 70s. It's just today they're doing it much, much better. And so I think an answer to this, Henry, and this is everything I know about this, is that what he's suggesting is that if we took the information that we now have about how the brain functions, that we know scientifically how it functions, and we were to meld that with our education, we would just be that much better at it. And you're absolutely right. Where we've gotten to today, and we've been doing this for a long time, is good.
But I want to answer that because
I guess my point, though, is that it seems to me, I totally agree. I'm not in disagreement here, but it seems to me that another thing we ought to be studying is what are those kinds of skill sets that people have in that kind of situation? I mean, what are the things people are doing to incorporate that knowledge? Because some of those kinds of things we ought to maybe be considering, along with these other things, if we're going to kind of think about where to go with education.
Good.
In terms of those things. And the other thing that, I just have one other thing that I think is a real challenge in here, and that is that I as a teacher like students that have history. And when we get them in college, they expect education to be a particular
it's already culturally set. I mean, you test a particular way, you do things a particular way, and one of the challenges, I think, is if you do these wonderful kinds of ideas, I think you will have a dropout rate that will be quite alarming, and in terms of people not knowing what to do because they're unprepared in that kind of situation. And I think that's another challenge we will have to face in trying to, make that switch.
Okay, for our distance audience, the comment, and this is very truncated, is that number one, in the classroom, there's a certain skill set that we know that students are getting, and if we move into a new paradigm, we have to be conscious of that skill set that has been successful and how do we continue to cultivate those. I think I've said that right. The second part to this is that there's sort of a cultural expectation to the way class is taught, and when students do come into our environment, there's an expectation that class will be taught in a certain way, that tests will be given in a certain way, and there's a concern that there will be sort of a cultural shock if we change that dramatically. So good comments.
Can I just say one word? I certainly agree, and especially about the point about the transition, that if you just did this tomorrow and said, Bismarck State's a new place, welcome. I think that the habit, which is ingrained in us from our earliest childhood, of the way one learns, the structure that, in which one learns would be so shattered that there would be a high dropout rate. There would be a rough transition. That's true of almost all paradigm shifts, and so I think one needs to do it slowly and introduce things organically and not just have a fundamental break. That's why a college within the college is, I think, a better approach, or to do it in experimental ways. But back to the question of, the challenge was sort of, well, this has been working for 2,000 years, what makes us think that it's stopped working? I do think there are some big differences. The pace of life today is way different from when I grew up. When Charles Dickens, and I actually grew up a little after Charles Dickens, but when Charles Dickens was writing Bleak House, he had a public whose pace enabled them to read a 1,000-page novel. That pace has changed, and so it's a very different world. And secondly, television. When I was growing up in Dickinson in the 1960s, we had 2 stations, and they were KFYR and KDIX, CBS and NBC, and it all looked like snow on these horrible little black and white television sets, and you could sort of make out Beaver Cleaver behind the snow, and it was on for about 7 hours a day, and that was it. When I moved to town, I got an HD television, and the guy who came to install it must be an expert, because he hooked it all up for me, and then he put it on an HD basketball game, some minor Swedish basketball game, and I sat there and I said to him, I will never work again. Because it is so compelling. It is so visually gorgeous, it is seductive, it is arousing, there is something so potent about where we are in our televideo culture. When I was growing up, 2 stations, today 500, if you add the internet and so on, video games, arcades, personal communications devices. We are living in a much different age. And the student that I was in 1970, when I went to college in 1973, I had grown up in exactly as Henry is saying. I'd grown up in a world in which you sat in a classroom and Mike McCormick gave you a splendid lecture for 45 minutes, and you drank it in because that was the way you learned, and that was that was the framework of your pedagogy, and it worked. But I've watched in my lifetime as the book has been diminished, and the lecture and the media, broadly defined, has become almost infinitely more compelling and more sophisticated, and that drug. I know this in my life, I don't know if you know it in your life, but if I make the mistake on a Saturday afternoon of turning my television on, about 2:30 in the morning I go to sleep having watched, a Three's Company marathon. I mean, seriously, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but if capitalism ever wanted a drug that would destroy the capacity to read Bleak House, it found it. And it's going to get better every second for the rest of our lives. And to think that an hour-long lecture on the Battle of Shiloh can compete with that world is, I think, just wrong. And I think you see it. I think we see it measurably. I know an English professor at this institution who has told me that her students are terrific, but they don't read in the way that you and I think they should read. And why condemn them? Because they are what they are, and they're a product of this culture. It's not their K through 12, it's not their parents, it's the zeitgeist, it's the way this culture goes about its business. And my daughter can literally, she's been typing since she was 6 years old, and she can literally be talking to me and watching an episode of Monk and be texting her friends and taking a picture and doing a whole range of things at once in a highly sophisticated way. And there's no reason to despise that. What we want to do is harness it and make it a tool of creative learning in the 21st century instead of decrying it as some diversion. Because I think if we try to maintain a two culture, we're going to create elites. We're going to have, Mike McCormick's students who love what he does and thrive in it, and they're going to become the cultural priesthood. And then we're going to have everybody else who doesn't find that model workable, and we're going to create a two-tiered culture of the intellectual haves and the intellectual have-nots, and it's a terrible mistake from a Jeffersonian point of view, I think.
Okay. More questions? In the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have one question about, in your 21st century student, or man or woman of the 21st century, where does the sense of wonder or coming into place? I mean, we study science because we have a sense of wonder and we want to discover things, not just because of its utilitarian aspects or the fact that it's useful, but because we want to discover something and it's an intrinsic need in the human being. So where does that come in your 21st century education process?
Okay, the question is, in the 21st century, where does the sense of wonder come in play? Which I think is a wonderful question because it talks about human curiosity, I think, and what does amaze us. This morning from my office, I was calling people in to look at the sunrise. It was just gorgeous this morning, just unbelievably gorgeous, and there's a sense of wonder. So at any rate, that's the question. Go ahead.
Well, I think wonder is a constant. I think everyone is curious, and I think every 5-year-old is curious, and that people blink out as they go through life because of a whole range of things, but one of them is that education becomes a chore rather than a thrill. And so I think we need to figure out how to build the thrill back in. But I remember, for example, seeing a National Geographic. I mean, we live in an age when wonder, I think, should be easier than ever before. If you look at that, of the satellite photo of the mall the other day, it just fills you with wonder, the largest crowd in the history of Washington, D.C., seen from a satellite. But I remember the National Geographic where they took the Hubble telescope once they put the corrective lenses on it, and they deliberately turned it to the emptiest place in the sky. They figured out where's the emptiest corridor of the night sky, and they turned it there and took a photograph. And the photograph is a fold out in the National Geographic, and when you look at it, it's cosmos after solar system after cosmos after universe after galaxy in every direction. And when you look at that, you just burst with wonder to think, oh my goodness, when I was growing up, what was the best image you ever had of the solar system? It was one of those sort of cheesy Life magazines of the Jupiter in orange and Saturn with its rings, and look at what we have today. We have imagery of absolutely everything from the internal organs of the body to we're almost imaging quantum movement now, to the outer reaches of the solar system, the graphics of our time, the MRIs of our time. I mean, we have the capacity to heighten wonder because of the tools of this culture. And so I think professors, teachers have more and more and more tools at their disposal, and that now what we need to do is to make sure that they're presented in a way that inspires wonder rather than shuts it down. But I don't think that I think wonder is a constant that's not in any danger of going away.
Yeah. I would agree. I think the curiosity, the human capacity for curiosity is amazing. And one of the things, and sorry to use that book again, Henry, but on Brain Rules, I recommend it to everybody. But one of the things he talks about is taking his 2-year-old out for a walk on the sidewalk, and how everything, and I was thinking about my own sons at that point, how everything, the bug going across the sidewalk was just amazing to this 2-year-old who wanted to follow the bug and, you know, check out the legs and find out what happens when you step on them, you know, all that stuff that's just, and I think that, and adding on to what Clay was saying, I think that technology that we have, the ability to see the smallest things and the largest things in HD now really enhances, I think, that sense of wonder. I think we as humans, the ability that we have to just to be curious, and if there's anything else that we can do in education, it's to keep students curious. That's probably the greatest contribution we can give to them.
But we have to build structures of wonder, and I mean, for example, Thoreau says in Walden that if you want to go out and look at wildlife, the worst thing you can do is go out and, you know, chase through a wildlife zone. What he says, what you need to do, he says, if you will sit down on a rock, all the wildlife will come to you. And he's using that as a metaphor for learning. That, you know, we need to find ways to break the pace of our lives so that we can awaken to wonder instead of seeing a bug and letting that pass through the brain and in every other category. So we need to find ways to disruptive learning innovations to thwart the kind of treadmill pace that we're in to allow wonder to seep in, because I can't wonder when I'm just chasing around. I don't suppose you can either. But when I stop, I mean, I was just thinking about this, for example. Here there are scientists in the room who can explain this, but if you think of atomic structure, Larry, why is gold gold and hydrogen hydrogen? You know, but if it's the same protons and neutrons and electrons and other subatomic particles. In other words, an electron is an electron. And so the way you combine them makes something hydrogen and something iron. How does that work? I mean, I have no idea how that works. I know there are chemists who can explain that it works and how to manipulate it, but why can you take these basic building blocks of the universe, and depending on how they get combined, one of them turns out to be helium, and another one turns out to be uranium. Do you understand this? I don't understand this, but if you don't feel wonder about that, I mean, that's pretty amazing, don't you think, that just recombination can create fundamentally different things? You can pass your hand through oxygen, but you can't pass your hand through uranium? You don't?
Oh yeah, I'm with you, Clay.
Are you just awash in wonder at this? You know?
I'm awash with wonder.
Here's another one in quantum mechanics. Let me just give you, every student should have some quantum mechanics. Quantum theory has shown that a discrete particle at one end of the universe and a discrete particle at the other end of the universe can affect each other, and the speed of light could never make them connect. That somehow something wiggles at this end of the universe and it's a gazillion light years from something else, and the other thing wiggles too, and there's no real capacity to understand how this happens. So quantum theory awakens wonder. The Hubble telescope, microscopes, I mean, the tools that we have, and the new conception of the post-Newtonian conception of basic science, at least of physics and light, it forces you into a situation of wonder. So we're living in an age when uncertainty has replaced Newtonian certitude. For Jefferson, the world was a Newtonian place, and everything made sense. I mean, Jefferson never at once in his life said something doesn't make sense. But for us, in a quantum age, things are radically unstable, and that's both a good and a bad, but it means wonder is certainly going to get its chance in a world where you can no longer predict in a precise Newtonian way how particles will behave. So I think that we need to make sure that our curriculum is wonder-driven rather than self-satisfied and certain. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. More questions?
I think we're about done here.
I
aren't we?
think we're
Yes.
getting, I just want to make sure we're getting some questions. We got a chat question? No? Sadly, no.
yes.
Okay.
I think they're gone.
All right. Any other questions?
There's one,
Comments?
another one in the back.
Our physicist back here.
I was just wondering again, are we at the mercy of technology? Like, our students are using cell phones, they're chatting online and all these things. All these things are good, but are we at the mercy of those instruments of technology, or should we also be discouraging them to be doing some of that stuff? I mean, and that's going back to the fact that somebody can't read a 1,000-page novel.
So are we the masters of technology, or I guess, Tony, are we the masters of technology, or is technology mastering us? Yeah,
It's a dialogue.
that
It
is.
cuts both ways. Can I just, I think we should quit, but can I just change the subject for one last little point?
Do you want to answer his question first?
I think it cuts both ways. I think that, I mean, I've heard teachers say that they have, for example, been unable to prohibit cell phones. That it's like remember when the slide rule was being replaced by the Texas Instruments calculator, and a whole generation of teachers tried to be the last to hold away the barbarians from that, and you know, I mean, these things just pass, and I think there will be no practical way. I mean, I think my daughter's daughter will be wired in ways that we can't even conceive of. This will be regarded as an exceedingly clumsy device. And so we're just going to have to build new paradigms of learning that take advantage of this rather than try to check it at the door. So I think that, as with all technologies, it cuts both ways. But it can be a miraculous tool, and we should just simply get on board and figure out how to use it that way. That would be my suggestion to it.
And then you want to make a closing
I
comment?
just want to make a case. We just want to very quickly make the case for the humanities. You know, we were talking about what this person should know: Arabic and quantum theory, and how to read the inauguration. And it sounds like a pretty daunting new curriculum. And I hear you when you say we also want people who can actually function in the world. Those are somewhat different goals, but I hear you. You know, functionality is something is a good. But I just want to quickly make the case for the humanities, and here's how. There's no substitute for it. I read Crime and Punishment over Christmas, and I didn't know I was going to read Crime and Punishment. It was more or less accidental. I don't know how. I couldn't trace how it came to me, but I bought the book and I read it, and it just swept me away. And there's no other way to get at certain questions. And while I was reading it, it's a book about a young man who's poor in St. Petersburg, Russia, and he sort of has this theory of the Superman, and he's basically having a low-level nervous breakdown. And he murders an aging pawnbroker for no reason, really, and then the rest of the novel, that all happens in the first couple of chapters, and the rest of the novel is essentially how he comes undone over his own guilt and sense of remorse. So I read this, and I'll say for the record, I've never murdered anyone, and I've never been in a court of law. I've never been sued. I mean, so I'm a reasonably well-adjusted human being who lives by the rules of our culture. But when I read this, when I read Crime and Punishment, it went straight into my soul, Larry, and I thought about guilt and sin and crime and abnormal behavior and how we prey upon ourselves and what plagues us and redemption. And I mean, I had a really, really deep experience that was quite troubling, actually, but it was deeply rich. And it came about, I mean, if you think about it, how odd it is. I just opened this, a book, and it could have been a book about neuropsychology, and it could have been a book by Al Franken, and it could have been
Senator Al Franken, I think.
but all these are basically interchangeable units. And if you open that one, Crime and Punishment, and do what Thoreau says, give yourself to it, really surrender to it, it has this unbelievable power to make you wrestle with the very stuff of what it is to be human. And Hamlet does that, and the Iliad does that, and the Odyssey does that, and My Antonia does that, and Jane Eyre does that, and Emily Dickinson does that. And so no matter what else we do, no matter how much we get addicted to our tools, the thing that somehow we have to figure out how to continue to keep the humanities central to this quest, because the humanities are these texts which enable us to open windows into the deepest questions of what it is to be alive and to be in a relationship and to be a parent and to be jealous or whatever, to be beset by guilt or ecstasy or whatever it is. And there's no other way to get at this. And you can, and I believe me, if you watch the Three's Company marathon, it just doesn't do it. It just doesn't. It doesn't get very far in. Crime and Punishment does. And so we have to somehow, in this, as the pace accelerates, we have to find a way to keep Crime and Punishment and Hamlet central. And the only way to do that is to make peace with the technological revolution and make that a tool of that text, rather than saying, when you're reading this text, I want you to go into a dark room and shut everything off and just sit there and deal with it, because I think that won't work anymore. That worked when I was a child, and it certainly worked when Dickens was a child. But our children and our grandchildren are not going to have patience with that. And so we have to find the way to keep it central, because if you said to me, what was the best thing that happened to you in 2008, and it was one of the richest years of my life, I would put reading Crime and Punishment in the top 2 or 3. And yet it was a week in which I did very little else. And I should have been doing a lot else.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying about how the danger is that we're going to jettison the great texts because they're too tedious?
Before we take too much stock into Thoreau, I should point out too that when you read Walden, he says that he has figured out how to live his life in study by working 6 weeks a year. He had economically figured out that he can work 6 weeks and live the rest of the year in study, which would be a wonderful environment, but not what most of us can do. But it certainly is, staying in touch with that keeps us in touch with our humanity. And I certainly know that those of us in this room that are involved in education and our distant audience that's involved in business will struggle with the issue of the up and rising generation and how we're going to meet the challenges, these technological challenges, but how we're going to meet the challenges of dealing with a generation that will be replacing us in education and in business. And it's certainly a daunting task, and one that none of us have the answers to. But we certainly had fun today, Clay, in listening to you. And it certainly challenges all of us to think, I think, as an educator, it certainly challenges me to think about how we are going to meet those challenges. We're raising a generation today. Clay talked about the television with the 2 channels. A generation is being raised today that has never walked across the room to change a TV channel. Ever. They've had a remote their entire life. The internet has been accessible to them their entire lives. And just think about that. You've got a question. My dad used to tell me to go look it up in the encyclopedia, which was about a 1955 encyclopedia, so it was probably already outdated. But today, you tell your son or daughter to look it up, they're going to jump on the internet, and hopefully they're going to hit the right website and get the right information that's updated and is current and stuff. And so that's our challenge as educators and as business folks. The challenge is that how do we continue into the future and be successful, like Dr. Riegler talked about. We've been successful. How do we continue to be successful in this rapidly changing environment? And so, Clay, we certainly want to thank you for challenging all of it.
Can I just say, thank you.